Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to class. Sorry, I got a little bit of a ringing feedback. Well, we have a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started in prayer so we can get into it. Father in heaven, you are majestic and holy. We are so unworthy to come before you in your presence, but we're so grateful, God, that Jesus has cleansed us of our sins. We ask for forgiveness now as we approach you, and we ask that you would grant us the open minds and hearts that we need to learn from you and to learn from your word this evening. Father, we pray that we'll look back and learn lessons from the Jews who thought they were doing what was right, but in the end found out that your ways are much higher than their ways. Help us to learn that lesson tonight. Help us to please you in all that we do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So it is the year 167 BC, and Antiochus Epiphanes of the Seleucids has just entered Jerusalem. He has defiled the temple. He has banned Judaism and is murdering any Jew who refuses to convert to Hellenism. Now, it is so important to put ourselves in the Jewish shoes theologically. By this time, it has been 250 years since they've heard a word from one of God's prophets, but they remember the prophecies. They remember things about how God would establish this glorious city of Jerusalem, Zion, and all the nations would flow to it to learn from it. They remember God saying He will establish this righteous king on the throne. He made promises that the king would actually be so special that he would also be high priest, and that the offices of king and high priest would be combined together to bring unity to his people and ultimately to the world. They remembered Abraham and the promise through him that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Yet now here we are in 167 BC, and the seed of Abraham is being slaughtered by Antiochus Epiphanes. The Jews have no king. The high priesthood has been corrupted by a man named Jason, who bribed Antiochus Epiphanes for the spot. The temple is not glorious at all, and instead of unity, there is only war. So an aged priest named Mattathias Hasmoneus knew something had to be done and took matters into his own hands. In the city of Modin, about 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem, a Greek soldier ordered a crowd of Jews, specifically though, he ordered Mattathias to offer a sacrifice to Zeus, to which Mattathias said this. He said in a loud voice, "Although all the Gentiles in the king's realm obey him, so that they forsake the religion of their ancestors and consent to the king's orders, yet I and my sons and my kindred will keep to the covenant of our ancestors. Heaven forbid that we should forsake the law and the commandments. We will not obey the words of the king by departing from our religion in the slightest degree." So another Jew hears him give this speech. But this Jew is not so concerned about preserving religion. He wants to get on the good side of the Greeks to spare his life. So he says, "I'll make the sacrifice to Zeus." And Mattathias kills that Jew. And he kills the Greek officer who was forcing him to make that sacrifice. And then he gives another speech. And he says, "Anybody who wants to be faithful to the covenant and refuses to take on Greek religion, you follow me out into the wilderness and seek refuge." And that's what they do. His 5 sons and many righteous people follow him out of the wilderness. But the thing is, Antiochus' army chases them. And they come upon a group of Jews huddled in a cave on the Sabbath day, and they want them to come out. They want them to participate in the Greek religion, to profane the Sabbath. And the Jews refused to do that. And so the Greeks attacked them and killed them, and they did absolutely nothing to stop it. In fact, this is what happens after the Greeks killed those Jews. It says they did not retaliate. They neither threw stones nor blocked up their secret refuges. They said, "Let us all die in innocence. Heaven and earth are our witnesses that you destroy us unjustly." Well, Mattathias and his friends saw this, and they realized this can't be our response. We can't just roll over and die and let the Greeks kill us anymore. And so, it says, they said to one another, if we all do as our kindred have done, and do not fight against the Gentiles for our lives and our laws, they will soon destroy us from the earth. So on that day they came to this decision, let us fight against anyone who attacks us on the Sabbath, so that we may not die as our kindred died in their secret refuges. So Mattathias, along with the Hasidim, the pious ones, gathered an army, and they put the Greeks to flight. And about a year later, at his death in 166 BC, he urged his brethren to continue the fight under the military leadership of his son, Judas Maccabees, which was a nickname meaning hammer, and under the counsel of his son Simon, which means the wise. And here's the message I want us to get this morning, or this evening, that is, God's ways are not our ways. Isaiah 55, God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. When you put yourself in their shoes, you can understand on a human level why they led this revolt. They didn't want to be killed, I mean, that's a given. But they also wanted to help bring God's promises to fruition. If God made all these promises to the Jewish seed and they just let the Jewish seed die, how is God going to fulfill His promises? If God promised to put a king on the throne, but the Greeks are, killing all the Jews, how in the world are they going to have a king on the throne? If we don't fight, how can God fulfill His promises? Well, the problem is God didn't tell them to do this. And this entire plan, as it works itself out, still will not accomplish what they set out and thought it would accomplish. And in fact, it will prove to be harmful to them in many ways. And I think a perfect microcosm of this whole plan in general is found with Mattathias' son Eleazar Avaran, which means piercer, probably from elephant piercer. He has a pretty embarrassing obituary. In one of the battles with the Seleucids, he sneaks up on an elephant that he thinks belongs to one of the Syrian kings, and so he stabs the elephant in the stomach, and the elephant dies and falls on him and kills him. But the crazy thing is it was the wrong elephant. So, on your chart that I gave you, he dies by killing the wrong elephant. To me, this is a microcosm of the problem with this entire Maccabean revolt and all the subsequent wars by the Hasmonean dynasty. The whole operation is like stabbing the wrong elephant and dying in the process. It's something they think is going to bring freedom and liberation and really help God out. But ultimately it'll be for nothing. And interestingly, the Jews, when they look back on Judas and Mattathias and all these guys, they view them as heroes, great heroes of the faith. But when God prophesies about this happening in Daniel, He says when they fall, they will be granted a little help. That's how God describes the Maccabean revolt, a little help. God doesn't see this as some great act of liberation for His people, but just a little help. That's because His ways are not man's ways, and He had something completely different in mind for His promises. Any comments or questions about any of that? Mike?
I see where you're getting that, but when they started, was it their intention to help to end up what you said, or was it more like during the period of the Judges, when a group would come in and oppress the people who were living rightly, and they would be oppressed, God would send deliverance. But is what's wrong with fighting back? Mm-hmm. And that's, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, World War II, they were sheep. And they didn't fight back, which led to the creation of Israel, where now they do fight back. So can you see where I'm getting with that?
Yeah, sure. And that's a really good question. I would say in the period of Judges, at least it seems that God was there. He was involved. He was answering prayers. here they don't really have a word from God on this. They just take it upon themselves. Now, again, it's one of those things. It's kind of like the Jewish misunderstanding of Jesus, right? We can say, oh, how foolish. How could they not know? He was coming to set up a spiritual kingdom. But if we lived there, like, we would have done the same thing. So I am kind of dogging, I guess, I don't know if that's the best word. I'm criticizing the Maccabean revolt, but I think probably if I lived back then, that's what I would have done too. I would have took up arms. Now, that's just kind of what they always thought, especially with the prophecies about God's people conquering the Gentiles. And it's a lot of military language in the prophecies, even about Jesus. So yeah, why not fight? That's a good question. Can we blame them? I don't know how much we can blame them, but we do know it did not really end up working well at all. Okay, I saw a ton of hands, but hopefully it's not all to comment on that comment, because I'm not sure if we can handle all that. Brenda?
I was just going to say, when you first gave the quote of Matthias and his standing up to the Greek officer, as I'm listening, he didn't use the word God, he just said our religion. I heard you right. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wait, what's his loyalty to his religion, his own background, or is it to the Lord?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would make that much out of that, but I do think he believed he was faithful to the Lord, for sure, and the religion was a part of that. Jason?
Raises some interesting questions for us, especially let's say we look back to our own American Revolution in terms of how we relate to people who have governed us, to people who may be in a separate country, and what we're to do. I can make the case that if we lived in the revolutionary time period, we should have supported the government that existed, because I think that's what God would have had us to do. At the same time, if I lived in that time period, I probably would have been one of the revolutionaries.
Sure.
And so it makes it difficult for how much can we politicize ourselves in our day-to-day lives, and how much energy we put, especially living in a democracy, because some of that is part of being a good citizen, and we're supposed to do that.
Yeah.
But then how far do we take that?
Yeah.
And how much do we quote-unquote fight?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a very deep subject. I want to say I don't necessarily know that God would look on Mattathias as sinful here. That they actually sinned by going to battle against the Greeks. I can't really say that. But what I can say is God's ways are not man's ways. And what they think was going to ultimately bring about the fulfillment of God's purposes actually did not at all. It was very different than what God had in mind. But can I say they actually sinned against God by doing that? I'm not sure. I'm going to leave that in God's hands, especially with, like you said, all the history before about them fighting their enemies and things like that. So, yeah, really good. Deep thoughts, guys. I really appreciate that. Let's talk about the Hasidim, all right? They're the pious ones. Important to remember, a lot of the Jews were converting to Hellenism and adopting the Greek culture and Greek religion. In fact, Jason, who bribed Antiochus Epiphanes to become high priest, he actually built a gymnasium and encouraged the Jews to participate in sporting events completely naked. That's how the Greeks did it, which was an abomination. They were, by the way, 1st, 2nd Maccabees are books written during this years of silence period, not by prophets of God, but just Jewish historians recording all of this for us. So in Maccabees, he talks about, in those days, I'm not going to read this whole thing, there appeared in Israel transgressors of the law, who seduced many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles all around us. Since we've separated from them, many evils have come upon us. And then he talks about the gymnasium, and they allied themselves with the Gentiles. They sold themselves to wrongdoing. So the Hasidim were determined, no, we're going to stay faithful to God's covenant. We are not going to give ourselves to the Greek ways or the Greek religion. And in order to be absolutely certain that they were keeping God's laws, they made a bunch of rules to help them avoid breaking God's laws. They created these rules kind of like as a fence or like a barrier to not even get close to breaking one of God's laws. So for instance, God said to keep the Sabbath day holy and do no work on the Sabbath. Well, that leads to a great question. What constitutes work on the Sabbath. Now, certainly we shouldn't go about our normal business of making money or going out to work in the fields to get crops and all that. We get that. But what about other acts of exertion? What about other acts of work? How far does it go before it's considered work and breaking the Sabbath? So, interestingly, in the New Testament, and again, the New Testament, it doesn't make any big deal of this. You just kind of go along and you read it in Acts chapter 1:12. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the Mount of Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. Well, somewhere along the line, the Hasidim made a rule that you could only walk 2,000 cubits, a little over half a mile, from your place of residence. Otherwise, you were breaking the Sabbath day. And they called it a Sabbath day's journey. Now, there are many problems that arose, okay? Number one, especially when the group later called the Pharisees arises from the Hasidim, they will start to think that their man-made rules are on par with God's Word. So they think if you break, like the Sabbath day's journey, you're sinning against God. You're not just breaking our man-made rules. And that becomes a problem with Jesus. Like in Matthew 15, the Pharisees, they ask him, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." And this was a ceremonial washing that they came up with to cleanse themselves from the Gentile uncleanness around them. And Jesus' disciples weren't doing that. Well, the traditions of the elders were these man-made rules started by the Hasidim and handed down and expanded upon for 200 years during the years of silence. And another problem was it made obedience to God, and this kind of goes to what Brenda was talking about with this idea of religion without God, but it made obedience to God all about strict adherence to these external rules, like washing your hands and not walking a certain distance. But they completely lost sight of the heart behind God's laws. They didn't get anything about mercy and justice and compassion. It was all about these rules. In fact, many of the Pharisees would create loopholes to get around these man-made laws while still appearing righteous. For instance, if they wanted to travel farther on the Sabbath day, what they would do before the Sabbath day is they would store food at a friend's house somewhere else, and then they would stay at the friend's house overnight before the Sabbath, and then on the Sabbath day, they could claim that as their residence and then go 2,000 cubits from that location. That's how crazy, right, some of this got. And it got way crazier. I mean, they had rules about vows, and vows were only binding if you used a certain verbiage when you actually verbalized the vow, or if you were facing a certain direction toward the temple or toward Jerusalem when you made the vow. Then you could get out of it. I mean, they had ways to get out of helping their aged parents through loopholes in their laws, and all the while thinking that they're righteous because we're still sticking to these traditions technically, but they're missing the whole point. And this is why Jesus he's amazing how patient he is, right? But they drive Jesus insane. And Jesus says, "Why do you yourselves transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of man." This is what happens eventually to the Pharisees, who are an offshoot of the Hasidim. But it's important to acknowledge this point. The Hasidim originally, back in the time of the Greeks, started with good intentions. And I think that's the way this whole period is defined. People starting with good intentions. Athis and this rebellion, it's good intentions. But it ends up hurting them down the road because God's ways are not man's ways. Well, let's get into this Hasmonean family. Now we have Judas Maccabees. After Mattathias dies in 166, his son Judas takes the lead militarily against the Seleucids. And his guerrilla warfare tactics are very effective, so much so that in 164 BC, they finally cleanse the temple, they kick the Greeks out of the temple, and they rededicate it to the Lord. And this is still celebrated today as Hanukkah. All right, Hanukkah means lights. And Jews burned candles in their homes, representing the rekindling of the lights in the temple when Judas set them free. But now there's a major question on the table. Do we stay satisfied with having the temple back and having our freedom to worship Yahweh again? Or do we also continue fighting for political freedom as well, so that we don't have to pay taxes to anybody, so that we can be our own independent kingdom? That is the question that I think, and most people think, leads to the divide of the Hasidim between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Because the Pharisees said, look, we should be satisfied now that we have religious freedom. But the Sadducees said, no, we need to keep fighting for political freedom as well. And so there's this divide here. And the Sadducees, unfortunately, we don't know much about the Sadducees. But we do know they didn't all believe that political freedom was best achieved through violence. They were willing to play the political game if necessary, if that would help them gain their power. And of course, they also rejected the traditions of the Pharisees. They didn't believe in an afterlife, in angels, or a final resurrection in the end. I've always wondered, like, where in the world did they get that, and why did they reject all that? We just don't know enough. We lost most of the records of the Sadducees when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in AD 70. And most that we know about the Sadducees was written by the Pharisees. So how much of that can you trust? Don't know. Well, now we have Jonathan Athis, and after Judas and his brother John Gaddy die in battle, their brother Jonathan Athis takes the mantle, and he was a shrewd politician. He becomes high priest by bribing the Greeks, and he ends up getting tricked by a Greek general named Trypho, and he's imprisoned and held for ransom. So then we have Simon, and he comes to pay the ransom to rescue Jonathan, but Trypho kills Jonathan anyway. And Simon does some amazing things for the Jews. He is such a key character. He makes an alliance with the Seleucid king Demetrius, who wants Trypho dead. He makes an alliance with Rome, and he finally captures control of what's called the citadel of Acro, which was a fortress built by Antiochus Epiphanes inside Jerusalem, where he could keep his soldiers. And Simon rescues them from all of that, and now finally Judah gains political freedom in 141 BC under Simon. This is such a huge deal, but as we'll see, it only lasts about 80 years. And now, by official decree by the Jews, the Hasmonean family will not only be high priests, but also rulers of the people. Not kings, because kings have to come from Judah, but they could be rulers. And so the rulership and the high priesthood will now stay officially in this Hasmonean dynasty, in this Hasmonean line. All is well until Simon is at a banquet, and his two sons, Mattathias II and Judas II, are assassinated at that banquet by Simon's son-in-law, and his surviving son, John Hyrcanus, now takes over, and he sets the Jews on even greater footing, because the Seleucids, by this point, they are so weak. The Parthians have weakened them so much. The Romans, they're off busy dealing with their own civil wars and their own problems with the Republic. And so now there's kind of this green light for John Hyrcanus to go and conquer territory, uncontested. And it's amazing because when the Jews first returned from captivity, this was their territory, this little tiny box here of Judea, but under Hyrcanus and his expansion, it grows back nearly to the size it had been in the golden era under Solomon. And what's interesting about Hyrcanus is he goes around forcing people to convert to Judaism. He forces the Idumeans, or the Edomites, to convert to Judaism. He also forces the men in Samaria to be Jews, and he destroys the Samaritan temple in revenge for all the problems the Samaritans have caused them. You remember back when Zerubbabel came back in the land and the Samaritans gave them problems and sent letters to the king and just fought against them? Hyrcanus takes revenge on them for that. And here is the irony. Under Hyrcanus, within one generation, the Jews have become just like the people that they rose up to destroy. They hated the idea that the Greeks were defiling their temple and forcing them to adopt Hellenism. And yet now they're defiling people's temple and forcing people to become Jews. But again, if you're the Jews and you're looking at this, just imagine what you're thinking. You're thinking, look at our success. God is now giving us the promised land back again to our possession. But this, again, was not God's plan for converting the world to Him. His ways are not our ways. The key thing to remember is that the Idumeans are forced to become Jews. That'll be a key later. The Idumeans forced to become Jews. Well, now we have Aristobulus, because after John Hyrcanus dies, his son Aristobulus I takes the reign. And what's really unique about him is that he's the first one to accept the title king. All the others before were just rulers, but Aristobulus takes the title king. And so now you have likely some of the Jews looking at this as a fulfillment of Zechariah 6. Now we have a king and a priest in the same office. Combine that with the fact that Hyrcanus just gave us the promised land, and doesn't it look like God's promises are coming to fruition now? We have a king and a high priest. We have our promised land back until Aristobulus dies within 1 year of a disease that causes internal bleeding. And now his brother Alexander Janus takes over, and he is way worse than his father Hyrcanus. Very cruel, very evil. He's all about adopting Hellenistic culture, so much so that the Pharisees actually make an alliance with the Seleucids to kick him out. The Seleucids, who, by the way, are just so weak by now, and who were their enemies. I mean, again, the irony that now they're seeking help from the Greeks, who they originally rose up to fight against, to drive Alexander out. Well, it doesn't work. They end up losing, and Alexander Janus has 800 of the Pharisees crucified while he eats a banquet in front of them with all these concubines, and he murders their wives and children right in front of them so that is the last thing that they see before they die. It's the kind of guy Alexander Janus was. And he dies peacefully in his sleep. Go figure. But now Salome, Alexandra, becomes queen. She is his wife, and she becomes great friends with the Pharisees, giving them a chance to really grow and flourish as a group. She couldn't be high priest as a woman, so that went to her son, John Hyrcanus II. The problem is she had another son named Aristobulus II, and after her death, a civil war broke out between these two brothers. When mom dies, Aristobulus goes to battle against against Hyrcanus to take the kingship and to take the high priesthood from him. And Hyrcanus is pretty timid. And before things get too far out of control, Hyrcanus just tells his brother Aristobulus, look, you can have it. Okay, you can take the kingship. You can take the high priesthood. And that's when Antipater of Idumea comes along. And being from Idumea, it means he's an Edomite. And remember, his people were forced to become Jews by Hyrcanus I decades before. So there's a question about his legitimacy as a Jew. And that's important because he is Herod the Great's father, which means there's going to be a question about Herod the Great's legitimacy as a Jew as well. Well, Antipater really wants to gain control of Judea. And he knows that Hyrcanus is the weak one here. And if he can talk Hyrcanus into taking the kingship back from Aristobulus and the high priesthood back from Aristobulus, then he can be more easily manipulated. So he encourages this civil war to start again between these two brothers until Pompey of Rome gets involved. And remember from Sunday's class that Pompey, before he became a member of that first triumvirate, with Julius Caesar and Crassus, he was making a name for himself in the east. He was conquering the pirates on the Mediterranean Sea. He came in and took Syria in 64 BC, and then he comes down in 63 to Judah, and both sides, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, appeal to Pompey to help solve their dispute. And Pompey knows that John Hyrcanus is the weak one as well, and so he supports John Hyrcanus, because again, he knows if he's high priest, he can control John much more easily than he could Aristobulus. And so he gives him the high priesthood, and he gives the rulership to Antipater of Idumea. And this is another key point in their history. Judah now loses their political freedom in 63 BC. Their freedom lasted from 141 under Simon now to 63 BC. And now Judea is officially a Roman territory. And they don't even have a fully Jewish leader over them in Antipater. Well, Antipater, he was kind of happy about being ruler, but he had his sights set higher. He knew if you want to be somebody powerful in this life, you need to make friends with the Romans. Because the Romans are on the rise, as we saw in Sunday's class, so he befriends them. On more than one occasion, he helps the Romans. In fact, we learned on Sunday how Pompey and Julius Caesar got in a fight, and Pompey goes down to Egypt to flee. Well, Julius Caesar, he chases Pompey down to Egypt, and Julius's life is in danger. Antipater comes to actually help save Julius Caesar's life. And so Julius Caesar, in return, names him the official procurator of Judea in 47 BC, which means he's not just a Jewish ruler, he is a Roman representative. He is an official Roman ruler over the Jews. And he has, Antipater does, two sons, Phasael and Herod. And Phasael was governor over Jerusalem, and Herod was governor over Galilee. Well, Antipater ends up getting poisoned because of some political intrigue, and he dies. And then we were wondering what happens to Aristobulus II. Well, he really gets on Rome's nerves. He starts problems with Rome because he doesn't like that Pompey just gave his stuff away to his brother. So he gives Rome problems, and eventually he's taken prisoner to Rome, and Julius Caesar sets him free just to get on Pompey's nerves, and then Pompey's supporters poison Aristobulus II and his son Alexander II as well. So now, if I'm caught up on my clicking here, now we have Antigonus II. He is the final contender of the Hasmonean family for the throne, and he teams up with the Parthians. Remember, the Parthians were up northeast of Judea. They were a constant thorn in the Roman side. He teams up with the Parthians, and the Parthians name him the new high priest. And in 40 BC, he comes in and invades Judea with the Parthians, and he hauls... before he does that, so Antigonus actually cuts the ears off of John Hyrcanus II so that he's mutilated and cannot serve as high priest anymore. And then the Parthians take John Hyrcanus off as a captive for about 4 years. Antigonus also captures Antipater's son Phasael, puts him in prison, and Phasael ends up killing himself. But Antipater's other son, Herod, escaped to Rome. And when Herod escapes to Rome, he's one of the final ones left, he escapes to Rome and he tells Mark Antony, a member of that second triumvirate in Rome, about this rebellion in Judea by the Parthians and Antigonus. And so Mark Antony makes a deal with Herod, and he says, if you go back and you destroy Antigonus II and you drive out the Parthians, you get to be, quote, the king of the Jews. And that's what happens. They go to battle together. Herod and Mark Antony team up. They go and they drive out the Parthians and they kill Antigonus II. And now Herod is king of the Jews and will be from 37 BC until 4 AD. And now we have Herod the Great. And the problem is, remember, Herod is an Idumean. So there's a question about his legitimacy as king of the Jews. So he decides that he will marry into the Hasmonean family. He will marry the daughter of Alexander II so that he can have more credibility among the Jews. Well, he has some children, a couple kids, and then later he gets to thinking, the sons that I had by Mariamne, when they grow up, they're going to be more legitimate heirs to the throne than me. And so he gets paranoid, and he murders his wife, Mariamne. He murders his sons. He murders Aristobulus III, who was Mariamne's brother. And then 6 years later, he'll murder John Hyrcanus in order to eliminate all traces of the Hasmonean family. Yeah, John Hyrcanus is eliminated. Herod is the last man standing. And Herod was a great builder, and he even rebuilt the Jewish temple into a glorious structure, but he was also a homicidal maniac. Caesar Augustus had famously said, "It is better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son." Because in an effort, as a pseudo-Jew, he wouldn't slaughter his pig because that's an unclean animal to eat, but he'd be perfectly fine slaughtering his own family. That's how horrible he was. And here's my question. What's that? Sounds better in Greek, yeah. So with that in mind, how do you think Herod would react when he hears this question from the Magi in the east in Matthew 2? Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and we have come to worship him. Knowing what you know about Herod the Great, doesn't it make sense to read further in Matthew 2 that it said Herod was troubled and all Jerusalem with him? I think all Jerusalem with him was troubled because they knew he was a maniac. And rightly so, because what he does is he says, fine, all children 2 years old and under in Bethlehem will be slaughtered. That's his solution, because he wants to kill any possible claimant to the throne that might take his position of King of the Jews from him. And so now, as we close out, I want to talk about the Messianic expectation, because we've always been emphasizing history is his story. Jesus came in the fullness of times. And I just want you to see how all of this contributes to that idea, that even in Luke chapter 2 and 3, it says there was a state of expectation among the people. People were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem for several reasons. They knew they failed to establish the freedom they so desperately wanted. Look at where their Maccabean revolt got them. The king over them is just Rome's puppet, not even a legitimate Jew from Judah, and he's an evil maniac. Nothing like the righteous king of David that God had prophesied about. The priesthood was in shambles, nothing more than a political office controlled by the highest bidder. Religion has been reduced to nothing but an empty set of rules by arrogant, self-righteous elitists. And now there is more resentment and hostility against the Romans than even against the Greeks and the Persians before them, simply because the Jews had this 80-year period of taste of freedom. And then Rome came and took all that away from them, cut their legs from right out underneath. So they're this seething hatred for the Romans, and that of course gives rise to a Jewish group called the Zealots, right? They're terrorists who want to just destroy the Romans and lead revolts as much as they can. But by this point, here's the main point: people have realized we need God to do something. His ways are not our ways, and our ways have not worked, and we need Him to act on our behalf. This is another reason why it was the fullness of time for Jesus to come, because the Jews were in a state of exasperation. The Jews were in a state of desperation for God's solution to their problems. And often that's how God operates. He patiently allows us to try our own ways and to see where it leads and the folly of where it leads before He steps in to give us what we really need. And unfortunately, because God's ways are not man's ways, most of the Jews are tremendously disappointed that Jesus looks nothing like the divine Maccabean warrior who would finally come and deliver them from the Romans. So they crucified Him. And then God's ways and God's promises were fulfilled in a grander way than anyone could have imagined. I know that was a lecture, and I know Satan sent some demonic force not to turn the air conditioning on tonight. Thank you very much. So it's brutally hot, and you guys have been very patient with my lecture, and I hope that that is helpful and encouraging to you. And there's a change in the syllabus, so we're not going to get into Zechariah on Sunday. Adam's going to teach a couple classes on the 17 periods, and that's what the other handout is for. So look over that other handout that you got in preparation for Sunday, and then we will get into Zechariah the Sunday after that. Thank you so much.